panel tonight, we have Leslie Sharp, if you'll raise your hand, Alan Kent, and Gary Shaw. And of course, still outstanding is Casey Quinlan. So ladies and gentlemen, if you would, let's give a warm welcome to our panel. Leslie Sharp, Alan Kent, Gary Shaw, and Casey Quinlan.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
This is a good book. You've already heard that from others, but Coup in Dallas is something that anyone interested in this country, this president, this assassination, and the apparatus that carried out the coup, which I believe it was, needs to read this book. Now, it's kind of like maybe reading, what is it, Gone with the Wind, War and Peace, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. You know, it's lengthy, it's detailed, but you will learn something about internationally and nationally about the components that really make up who was behind the assassination of John Kennedy. So, let me just go ahead and introduce these guys that are with me. First of all, let me tell you about Hank. Just a little bit about Mr. Albarelli. He graduated from Antioch Law School, served in the Office of Personnel during the Carter administration, and was a field director for SEIU before launching his career as a reporter, during which time he traveled extensively throughout Europe, Asia, South Africa, and the Middle East, and the Sudan. May he rest in peace, because he passed away just a few years ago, before this book was finished. Secret Order is one of his books. If you've not read it, please do. A Terrible Mistake, one of the most detailed books about, one for one, George Hunter White and what went on in the MK Ultra and so forth. And then Coup in Dallas, of course, you've already been told about that. Leslie Sharp beside me is a freelance researcher and writer working from Santa Fe and Dallas. Born in the Texas Panhandle, that's the reason I talked to her. She has lived in 15 cities across the U.S. and the Republic of Ireland in pursuit of a marketing career in luxury hotels and resorts that provided her a unique vantage point from which to observe the military-industrial complex. In the mid-90s, she paused to take stock and determined that she would help unravel the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, a commitment fulfilled in Hank Albarelli's Coup in Dallas. Then further to my right is Mr. Alan Kent, longtime lay student of the flow of American history, with a research emphasis on the roots of political and economic power and the violence in the shaping of what has become the current world. Developed a deep respect for the importance of primary evidence when it can be found. His lengthy communication with Hank Albarelli began in 2013, and he has been on board with the development of the book since. Over decades, Kent performed freelance research for Albarelli and for multiple authors, working toward the historical unraveling of the deep events, and is honored to be a part of what he believes is the most significant effort to probe the assassination of President John F. Kennedy to date. So I welcome these two, and I hope you'll enjoy what they're going to say. I don't know how you can enjoy some of the stuff you're going to learn, but I hope you'll learn from it. So, Alan, I think I'll ask you to go ahead and elaborate a little bit on your connection to Hank and the book.
Sure. I believe so. Let's see if it's working. Yeah. It appears to be working.
If you can hold it, that'd be great.
And what?
If you can hold it.
Oh, I have to hold it. Okay, that's better. Yes. Okay. I met Hank in 2013. I had messaged him through Facebook, suggested a piece of research to him that he found very compelling, and we began to communicate. He began to send me various parts of communication he was having with other researchers, and we traded opinions, and we got to know each other very well, and I obviously admired him greatly, and I appreciated the depth of his research, and I appreciated who he was. He was able to get people to talk to him that other researchers wouldn't even try to talk to him. And that's a rare quality. And he got information. He got information out of people. That was very demanding. Okay, all right. How about this? He got information out of people that nobody else got out of people. He is also a huge music fan, and we ended up at a blues festival in Clarksdale, Mississippi, and had a great time, and didn't even talk about this stuff much. So that was Hank, and that was how I got to know him. Thank you.
Right. First, what can I say other than a hearty thank you, and I wish Casey was here to receive it, and my respect for him, who not only read Coup, but he understood it, and the implications for the history therein. Blessings to Casey. I think educators of his caliber and dedication are the front line of defense of our democracy. And what can I say to Gary Shaw? Other than, what? Why did you pull me up here? And what can I say? Gary has dedicated a huge chunk of his life to the fight. Other than I wish that he and Hank had met. I appreciate his patience and persistence, and that I'm so privileged to have had his support through a very difficult process. And a really special hat tip to Dan Storber, founder of Putumayo World Music, who has been on a crash course to absorb not just the big issues, but the minutiae of this case. His energy, commitment, and perspective and perception never ceased to amaze me. He has helped me understand the mandate of truth and reconciliation. This is Hank's book, H.P. Alvarelli. Hereinafter referred to as Hank, began his working life in the music industry. Okay. Following the weekend at Woodstock, he told the story that he and his girlfriend actually lost their day jobs when the local newspaper published a photo of them at the festival in spite of each having called in sick. He later had the privilege of meeting the renowned journalist, photographer, and music promoter Dick Waterman, who, among other contributions to blues in particular, was responsible for rediscovery of the legendary Sun House. Hank teamed up with Dick to promote local shows in and around his own home base, Burlington, Vermont. So, as Casey mentioned this morning, music seems to be the soul of the JFK assassination research community. In the late 1970s, Hank landed a job, as Gary just mentioned, in the Carter administration's White House Office of Personnel. I was left with the impression that he had a bird's eye view of how government works. And while he admired Carter, a fellow long-distance runner, he didn't like what he saw in D.C. Does anyone? In one of the hundreds of high strangeness and synchronicities, while living in D.C. that morning in September of 1976, he walked past the site of the horrific bombing that took the lives of Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffett, less than an hour after the tragedy. Adding to the synchronicity that Hank and I frequently shared, I later learned that friends of mine had hosted Letelier for dinner the night before. After Carter, Hank took a job as a regional director for the Service Employees International Union, a position that brought him into direct contact with the upper echelon, including John Sweeney, former president of AFL-CIO. Again, although he never said specifically, he intimated that government and union, as bureaucracies in his opinion, were just opposite sides of the same coin. I once asked if the agency, quote unquote, had ever attempted to recruit him, and he said only once, as he prepared for a trip to South Africa, where the Russians were making inroads and the SEIU was competing. After over a decade with the union, he paused, took stock, and decided to shift gears and launched into journalism. And that led to his investigation into the murder of CIA scientist Frank Olson. It was Hank who wrote the seminal expose on that murder, a book titled A Terrible Mistake, published by Tri-Day. Kudos to Chris. For those familiar with Errol Morris's documentary on that murder, titled Wormwood, you might be interested to know that Hank generously welcomed Morris and his team into his home in Florida, where he spent several days sharing his research and talking them through his investigation. You won't hear that in Morris's documentary, nor will you hear the name Pierre Lafitte. Had Hank lived, I believe his planned project, Wormwood Exposed, would have set that record straight. Which leads us to a primary actor in the investigation into Coup in Dallas, one Jean-Pierre Lafitte. And we'll speak more on that enigmatic character shortly. A truncated version of how I became part of this project with Hank. In late 1979, I answered a small ad in the Dallas Morning News to join the opening team as sales and marketing of Rosewood Hotel's flagship property, the mansion on Turtle Creek. In the midst of the 1970s silver debacle involving the sons, Herbert and Bunker Hunt, their sister, who was the second daughter of H.L.'s legitimate family, sheltered her own inheritance in a property development company she named Rosewood. I hadn't a clue, but I remember my father pleading with me to not take that job. Of course, I did. And in 1980, I helped launch promotion of the restaurant, bar, and soon-to-be a hotel operated by 21 Club out of New York. The mansion, by the way, was a stone's throw from General Walker's former residence, which I passed by on a daily basis. My first corporate account as director of sales was Brown Brothers Harriman, responsible for booking their annual board of directors meetings in Dallas. BBH is symbolic of the financial arm of the military-industrial complex, the primary focus of my near 30 years of research. As a side note, and or for the record, with the utmost respect for Professor Peter Dell Scott, I contend that we lost and we sacrificed the clarity of the complex when we dropped the terms military and industrial and replaced it with deep state, an innocuous term that was vulnerable from the outset to co-optation, as we have witnessed in the last 6 years and counting. A revealing snapshot of the ethos of Dallas while I was there, particularly among some within the Hunt family's Rosewood apparatus during those early years, it is germane to how I ended up working with Hank. Just before leaving for LA to market Caroline Hunt's newly purchased Hotel Bel Air, I witnessed senior managers of Rosewood Hotels who, without exception, had been recruited from old school Europe, dressed in brown shirts, in lieu of corporate starch whites, celebrating Hitler's birthday in the posh bar at the mansion. My study of, or call it obsession with, the assassination of John Kennedy began less than a decade later, just months after reading Dick Russell's The Man Who Knew Too Much while living in Dublin, Ireland. As I told Dick, thanks a lot, you pretty much altered the course of my life. Hank, too, recognized Dick's book as an extraordinary breakthrough. We laughed that between us we had 5 somewhat cannibalized copies. So when a friend from my Rosewood years contacted me in Dublin and insisted that I get Dick's book, I did. I immediately recognized names, in particular the Hunts of the infamous Dallas oil family that I had worked for, and began to pursue the clues Dick had provided. At the time, I only wanted to make sense of my own past. Fast forward to 2015, not long after journalist and author Jefferson Morley, a former Washington Post protege of a friend of mine, launched JFKFacts.org, I decided to start sharing some of the research I had accumulated and logged on using a pen name, Leslie Sharp, for reasons I can discuss later. It was on that forum that I interacted briefly with Hank Albarelli, When Jeff's blog seemed to go a bit dormant, I signed up on Facebook to continue posting research. Hank came across my Facebook page in mid-2017, messaged me, and we began daily phone conversations. He asked if I would co-write this book, and in early 2018, I traveled to meet him in person, and the rest is history. How personally poignant it is that I'm here in Dallas, full circle, talking about this on Hank's behalf, about Hunt, General Walker, General Willoughby, and related characters identified in the collection of the private record of Jean-Pierre Lafitte, specifically his 1963 date book that Hank lended access to. And this is the instrument itself. It's, just a day planner that I'll elaborate on how it came about, but it's, yeah, that's great.
You can see the notations
Yeah.
all through it that are key to what's going on,
Yeah.
okay?
I only wish that Hank was here in my shoes and I was sitting in the audience. May his soul may his soul rest in total peace, and may we do justice to his professional dedication and contributions. There are many angles from which to approach a limited introduction to Coup in Dallas, a 700-plus page book. While we provide a roadmap designed as a reading aid for what some have argued is a fairly complex expose, it would be more expedient for this particular venue to hone in on those specific aspects of Hank's investigation that he considered the most explosive, the most revelatory, the facts he knew would change the arc of history, if you will, especially the roles played by the enigmatic Lafitte and Nazi SS Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando, and best known for his role in rescuing Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. For instance, shouldn't I stress the fact that Hank tracked the continuity of Skorzeny's career as well as Lafitte's and others responsible for Dallas to their shared histories prior to and during World War II, throughout the Cold War, right up until November 22, as alluded to by Casey this morning. Within months of being contacted by Major Ralph Gannis, who had recently purchased the private papers of Otto Skorzeny, the Nazi commando that Hitler considered his favorite, Hank realized that he was central to that web of characters. He determined that Skorzeny had either directly or indirectly interfaced with the CIA's James Angleton via a criminal and intelligence chameleon known as Jean-Pierre Lafitte to pull off the hit in Dealey, an operation that Angleton cynically and devilishly titled Project Lancelot. It should be emphasized here that Hank does not open the book with a history of Cuba or of Vietnam, but of Europe, post-war Europe and North Africa, because that is where his investigation led. I'll also quote one of his more specific directives toward the end. Quote unquote, I think serious consideration should be given now to doing a 3 to 4 in pages that speak generally to Fourth Reich, rise up, revamped to these times, but true Nazism. Good way to end the book. Hank lays a firm foundation for the narrative when he focuses the first 2 chapters on the history of state-sponsored political murders from World War II tied to the rise of Nazism versus the spread of Soviet communism, the concomitant war crimes trials, and the quangos that sprouted up after the war. Quango, loosely defined as a semi-public administrative apparatus that derives power from government, specifically the World Commerce Corporation and its goddaughter, Permadex. But it's impossible to do justice to Hank's deep dive into that history in a limited time slot as this. For example, I would want to elaborate on his focus on Carlton Kuhn, a longtime intelligence agent and student of eugenics, operating throughout North Africa, who in 1943 proposed to his boss, OSS Director Bill Donovan, that the agency adopt political assassination as an instrument of state policy. Some 50-plus years later, Hank tells us in his introduction to Coup, that he discovered evidence of an ultra-secret agreement between the U.S. Department of Justice and Allen Dulles' CIA. The secret agreement, consummated in 1954, granted legal immunity to any qualified CIA employee, operative, or agent who committed a capital crime, including murder, while working on agency operations. We should let that sink in. So how did that 1954 agreement manifest in Dallas in 1963? I'll turn it back to Alan now to present what I consider a brilliant analysis of the chronology of events revealed by Pierre Lafitte. Alan was and remains the most qualified to take what Hank uncovered, factor in the decades of his own research that he has under his own belt, and make sense of this breakthrough. Following his presentation, I'll close with the provenance and the status of the authentication of the date book, the elephant in the room.
Thank you. That was lovely. And I will try to speak louder so people don't yell at me. So, as a unique primary source, the Lafitte Datebook allows us not only to draw reasonable conclusions about the progression of the 1963 plot to remove JFK, but to place important subsequent historical events in context that have not previously been available to us. Let's start on Friday, November 22nd, 1963, with Lafitte's entry. Renee T. Merde, fuck. Oh, Tippett, why? Ask J.A. who is Tippett. Clearly, something of significance has gone wrong with the plan that Pierre Lafitte had executed throughout October and November 1963. Pierre is recording the anger and befuddlement of his wife, Renee. That Lee Oswald has been taken into custody accused of the murder of Dallas police officer J.D. Tippett is the immediate cause of Renee's angst. Very likely, the nut of the problem is not that Tippett has been murdered, but that Oswald is being held by the Dallas police, will be accused of shooting the President of the United States, will be subjected to interrogation, and may well have the opportunity amidst the growing chaos to speak briefly with print journalists and say things like, "I'm just a patsy." The closest peek we will likely ever get to what was supposed to be happening is found in the account of given by a man who participated in the assassination in a very small way, a man that Pierre Lafitte had known and sometimes worked with for nearly a decade prior to the assassination of JFK and had visited in a Cuban prison in 1961, John Martino. In one of the very few confessions of involvement in the assassination that stands up, Martino revealed what he knew during the last year of his life when he well knew he had very little time left. To a close business associate and to an investigative reporter, Martino told essentially the same story. He had been involved as a courier of money and knew just enough to speak of outlines. Oswald had been part of the plan, but not as a shooter. He was supposed to meet a contact at the Texas Theater soon after which he was to be killed in a manner that would tie him to Castro's Cuba. Oswald made a mistake, Martino said. We couldn't get to him, and Jack Ruby needed to be brought into play as a desperation measure to eliminate Oswald. Thank you. There we go. Tuesday, November 26, 1963. DC and NYC. JJA meet 8 a.m. Pierre has flown east for the third recorded time in 1963. The first two meetings involved critical face-to-face contacts that cemented key directions in the ongoing plot. This one, featuring an early morning chat with Angleton, is probably of equal importance during a crucial time in which details need to be handled with efficiency. Thursday, November 28, 1963. Levine will deal with Marina. Call Madrid.
Very early on, Lafitte is aware that Marina Oswald will be dealt with by longtime CIA publicist Isaac Don Levine, who readers have been introduced to in detail. At the urging of former CIA head Alan Dulles, Life magazine publisher C.D. Jackson arranged to have Marina's story ghostwritten for the magazine. Dulles, Jackson, and Levine shared important history, having collaborated on a CIA-backed psychological warfare response to the 1953 death of Joseph Stalin. While the writing project did not come to fruition, Levine spent quality time with Marina before her Warren Commission testimony. Again, Angleton is involved in the mix. Call Madrid is a self-directive by Lafitte to phone Otto Skorzeny. Saturday, November 30th, 1963, Levine, AZ-4Z. What has no doubt been a difficult, stressful month for Lafitte, who has been tasked as the project manager for the murder of the most powerful head of state in the world, ends with more Levine, shrouded by a code similar to or identical to one Pierre had employed heavily in August of 1963. Sunday, December 1st, 1963, cabled to New York plus Madrid. Communication with the usual suspects. Wednesday, December 4th, 1963, Shells, Swetra, November 26th, W teams returned, November 28th. Seeming references to post-assassination dispersal and/or settling maneuvers, Swetra dispatched to Mexico in mid-November, accompanied by a team of Hungarian assets. The team flown into Fort Worth by Silverthorne on or about November 15th is mentioned once again. Shells is unclear. W teams refers to multiple teams provided for the operation by General Willoughby, dispersed and home after their tasks completed. Although, listen to Gary Shaw's presentation next for a different perspective on what W means. But Thursday, December 5th, 1963, J.A. close out Lancelot. And below that, the letter T. A directive from Angleton to wipe the slate clean on Lancelot, the name given very likely by JJA to the operation to assassinate President Kennedy. T will play a sizable role in the closeout, just as he played a large part in the planning and execution of Lancelot. 1964. While John Kennedy left with over 13,000 advisors in Vietnam, he also left with a plan to disengage from military involvement in Southeast Asia, a plan which was essentially overturned within 48 hours of his death. In truth, it was arguably on its way out while Kennedy was above ground, as what relatively little detail available to us about the high-level maneuvering that took place at the November 20th, 1963 SecDef conference in Honolulu suggests, but that's another story for another time. The rapidity with which the demise of JFK affected U.S. Vietnam planning is suggested by the account of researcher John Judge, whose mother, Marjorie C. Judge, was a 30-year civilian employee of the Pentagon. She was a manpower analyst for the Deputy Chief of Staff for the Personnel, working directly under the Joint Chiefs of Staff, 5 levels above top-level security. Among Ms. Judge's duties was to project national annual draft calls in advance and to pass those predictions along to the Selective Service System for planning purposes. She was given a current manpower force level by the Joint Chiefs, a projected force level, and statistical tables that would assist in determining the need for military personnel. She could project at a given period how many would die naturally or accidentally, how many would retire, enlist, re-enlist, discharge in given categories, and need to be replaced, John Judge told us. She would determine the annual draft calls needed to maintain needed force levels. From an office above her level of clearance, she would receive combat death and disabling predictions. The data was used by misjudged to project national yearly figures accurate to within 100 people in years when hundreds of thousands of people were being drafted. She was tasked with projecting totals to that degree of accuracy 5 years in advance. After she retired, John relates, I asked her about plans for the Vietnam War, since she would have been among the first to know them. She told me that in the spring of 1963, she was told to project a phased withdrawal of troops, with all troops out by the end of 1964. I then asked her when they told her they would escalate in Vietnam. Late November of '63, she said tersely. I asked her if it was the last week in November since Kennedy was killed on Friday the 22nd. The Monday following the assassination, she replied. I asked her if it was a few more advisors, how large an escalation. I couldn't believe the figures, she told me. I took them back to the Joint Chief's office and I said, these can't be right. They said, those are the figures and you'll use them. The data that was given to Marjorie Judge foretold a decade-long war with over 50,000 casualties. 1967 San Diego Union article, a newspaper article that interviewed Otto Skorzeny. And I quote Otto from '67. This man, he's telling a story, a U.S. military attaché, told me that the biggest successes of the American Army in Vietnam were based on the training and tactics evolved by my special forces. I hope I made some contribution. Vietnam is important to all of us. 23/7/1964, James. On the above date, Pierre Lafitte penned a letter to an old colleague and the man from whom he had taken direction in the 1963 operation against President Kennedy, James J. Angleton. In what was part of an extraordinary story, Hank Albarelli was able to cajole a member of the Angleton family to submit this letter as evidence in a piece of extended handwriting analysis. It's doubtful that the family member appreciated the nuances by which Lafitte was communicating with Angleton. The extant version of the letter that was submitted for analysis has been truncated by Hank, minimizing the discrete information that would be shared with handwriting and ink analysts. But a very significant line was summarized in communication between Hank, Alan, and Leslie. Lafitte agrees with Angleton on the merits of not having used Cubans in direct capacities. Lafitte and Angleton are referring to the non-use of anti-Castro Cubans as shooters in Dealey Plaza. Regardless of their passion and skill set, Cubans as assassins would have posed multiple potential problems. The anti-Castro Cuban community in southern Florida were known for their indiscreet chatter. Such boasting was one reason among many for the massive 1961 failure at the Bay of Pigs, and Angleton would have been well aware of that. From a counterintelligence perspective, Angleton would have assumed, probably correctly, that the Miami area anti-Cubanites were very likely honeycombed with Castro's G2 spies. Also, placing armed men of color in downtown Dallas in 1963 was an invitation to disaster. Far better to utilize white men such as Jean Suetra and his team, disciplined assassins who also spoke quite credible English. Much information remains in this letter. Pierre moves to information pertaining to the cleanup of the operation that has recently been executed. Harvey is agreeable to an illegible word, closure. The rest is fine so long as T agrees to all. Readers of this book are well familiar with William K. Harvey and the vitally important cog T. The rest, or worked out with Howard Group. Readers have encountered the Howard Corporation, an unusual financial entity held under the auspices of the Dallas-based intelligence-drenched Republic National Bank. The Howard Corporation et al. Is a name for a group of corporations whose stock is held in trust for the benefit of Republic stockholders, as a 1963 newspaper article declared. Howard Corporation assets, approximately $15 million in 1964, generating millions in profits annually, were essentially being run off the books in an arrangement that would later attract the interest of federal banking regulators. Under pressure to divest themselves from Howard in order to engage in the buying up of smaller banks, Republic did so in 1974, selling to American Airlines for $56.7 million. The three groups are personally disbanded, as they say, scattered to the wind, Lafitte tells Angleton. The groups Pierre refers to here are those that were flown into the Dallas-Fort Worth area in the week prior to the assassination of President Kennedy, groups who played roles on the ground in Dealey Plaza. From multiple indications in Lafitte's 1963 date book, Pierre is describing the Skorzeny-sourced team headed by French assassin Jean Suetra, a Charles Willoughby-supplied shooting team headed by longtime Willoughby asset Colonel Jack Cannon, and the Willoughby backup team mentioned late in November, on November 15th by Lafitte. These men are scattered to the wind, or so Lafitte and Angleton hope. The letter ends, "We go to New York as expected. I hope to find you both in the best of spirits," Pierre writes, foreshadowing a New York trip in which Pierre and Renee will meet with Angleton and his wife. Hank recorded the analysis of a former CIA employee who he interviewed in 1996, who declined to be named in this book. What he told Hank was that, What he told Hank was that it was a common ploy with CIA that there be 3 or 4 operations in play at one time, but only one actually fully planned and intended to go forward. It's similar to a sophisticated drug trafficker sending out 3 or 4 large shipments of drugs with the objective that only one shipment will actually make it to its intended destination. This description of what the ex-CIA employee contends is a frequently used tactical plan within CIA covert operations would explain a great deal of the confusion researchers into this topic have tried to deal with over the years. It becomes even more powerful as an explanatory device when we learn the identity of the official who did not care to be named. Colonel Albert Haney was one of several ex-agency operatives who'd retired to Florida that Albarelli interviewed during the 1990s. And Haney was a particularly big deal in intelligence circles. He had been the agency chief of staff in South Korea during the Korean War and had played a large part in extricating the severely wounded son of Allen Dulles from Korea with dispatch, becoming a close lifetime friend of Dulles in the process. Haney served under Frank Wisner as the tactical field leader of the 1954 Guatemalan coup, working with Tracy Barnes, David Phillips, Henry Heckscher et al. He knew the story of Pierre Lafitte's relationship to James Angleton and relayed a telling story about the pair that had been passed in agency circles to Hank, as well as a knowing claim about Jack Creighton's role in the Kennedy assassination. Let me wander a second here. The end. Those who we know from extensive presentation in Coup to have been key planners of the demise of JFK, all passed from this earth without a glove being laid on them. General Willoughby died in 1972, as did the Allen Dulles protege, T., who I contended in a lengthy essay toward the end of the book to have been Tracy Barnes. Otto Skorzeny died in 1975, and his wife Ilsa passed in 2001. Jack Creighton left in 2007. As for Pierre Lafitte, If Sid Gottlieb wasn't sure that Lafitte existed in the epistemology of the CIA, as he told Hank, Gottlieb was well aware that Pierre traveled extensively for the agency. While he seems to be almost invisible today, there's no doubt he existed, and that he moved with stealth and guile through some of the most amazing criminal collaborations with intelligence-connected figures in American history. Lafitte will be found only very lightly and occasionally in what author Peter Dale Scott has called archival history, but he and the milieu in which he moved during the 1950s and 60s looms large in our past and very likely in the shape of the world we wrestle with today. He was born in France in 1902 or 1907 or 1912, among the numerous birth dates he gave out over the years. Newspaper coverage during his aborted 1969 fraud trial gave his birth year as 1905. As Hank Albarelli relayed, after running straight into Lafitte in his decade-long research into the death of Frank Olson, he took a tip and went searching for Pierre, only to find out that he had died a few months before his arrival. Hank tells us that he set out to find Pierre about 9 months before I completed my book on Frank Olson's murder, and found his wife, Renee, who gave him the news about Pierre's departure. Hank's book was released in 2009. Regardless of which years we choose to place beside the alias that this unique figure used most frequently, he lived a very long life, extraordinarily long for one who was involved in the machinations that made up his world. He's probably buried somewhere under some name, with information of dubious value carved in a stone that lays over him. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. That was brilliant. And now the elephant in the room. In his 1963 date book, Lafitte recorded names, dates of meetings, arrangements, reminders, as well as cryptic and rather dynamic personal observations, many of which obviously relate to the plan to murder Kennedy in Dallas. The scene of the crime is where all investigations begin, so it only makes sense to us that this cold case murder investigation should resume here in Dallas. Not Chicago or Florida, not in New Orleans, but in the state of Texas and the city of Dallas. Had DA Henry Wade been half the district attorney that Jim Garrison was, Garrison might have been spared the personal and professional chaos he experienced by indicting Clay Shaw. Lafitte names 18 Dallas residents in his date book. On November 19, he writes, "The lay of the land, Dallas extreme. Renee says, oil smooths the way to silent and sometimes deadly change." She also told Hank in person, Dallas was the arms and legs of the CIA, and Hank concluded that the agency's southwestern outpost was located in the Republic National Bank of Dallas. Author Dick Russell, in his foreword for our book, writes, Lafitte's date book, a faux leather-bound red volume with a vintage Nazi coin taped to the inside front cover, is of immeasurable importance toward unraveling the takeover which took place that terrible day in Dallas, with ramifications that reverberate in our times. The assassination operation, Project Lancelot, is finally being exposed. Dick also analyzed a series of datebook entries Hank had shared with him. We include that limited analysis in the front matter of Coup, but let me give you his closing remark. In summary, it is possible from this datebook to piece together many things about the assassination that could be merely educated guesses until now. I believe, presuming that the datebook is verified as having been written by Lafitte in 1963, that this constitutes probably the strongest evidence that has ever come to light of a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. We're acutely aware that at the core of any skepticism of the history presented in Coup is whether or not we can trust the startling information we see in this datebook. So I'll now speak to the provenance of the instrument itself, Hank's account of how he gained access, and the ongoing efforts to have this record authenticated. The blank day planner that you've seen was produced by one of the nation's largest food distributors at the time, Sweet Life Foods, with offices throughout New England. Hank tracked down one of the executives of the company who confirmed that they gave the blank day planner as holiday gifts to their preferred customers. We didn't have a written record of that conversation, so I located the son of the CEO of Sweet Life from the early 60s who provided me with a written statement, and I quote, "I can confirm with 100% certainty that this was a planner from Sweet Life sent to customers late 1962 or early 1963. One of those blank Sweet Life date books was put into use on January 4, 1963 by one Pierre Lafitte, a trained chef." In Hank's introduction, he provides a succinct account of events that led him to the doorstep of a modest New Hampshire home, a personal experience packed with high strangeness and coincidence for Hank. He was too late to meet Pierre, but his widow was willing to engage, albeit cautiously at first, with Hank. I'll read Hank's own record of the events. Before I completed my book on Frank Olson's murder, I had the opportunity to meet the one person who was quite close to Lafitte, his wife. I had been informed by a highly respected journalist for the New York Times, John Crudson, that Lafitte had been living in a small town in New England for at least 12 years. By chance, I had relatives in a nearby town, and I turned to them for help in locating Lafitte. I'll pause and tell you that that relative was the former ambassador to Mexico. What was his name? Hill. Robert C. Hill. And Hill happened to live in the same town that Lafitte was living. But as it turned out, Lafitte was living openly with his wife. Understandably, I traveled as quickly as possible to the place where they resided, which was quite easy because I was still living in Vermont, where I'd gone to write the Olson book. Of course, I shared the location and address with the DA's office in Manhattan. This was while he was still kind of reassembling himself after the sort of catastrophe of the Frank Olson investigation. But he ventured there on his own. I was too late to find Pierre. He had passed away before my arrival, but as said, I had the opportunity to meet his wife, Renee. Our meeting was a cautious one, but I felt that by being honest about my interests and objectives, an initial bond of friendship was formed. What is important here is that I eventually gained conditional access to several of Lafitte's date books and a precious handful of his letters. I would guess that you can imagine my surprise when I was able to make out Lee Harvey Oswald's name in the 1963 date book. Over a short period, I found other names connected to Oswald's, some identified only by initials O, OS, JA, T. To make a long and convoluted story short, I was able to study Lafitte's date book, and as expected, although for entirely different reasons than my initial expectations, it was remarkable for its contents. Perhaps remarkable is not a strong enough word. There, in a worn but well-preserved leather-bound date book, was a stunning parade of names: Angleton, Oswald, Joanides, Labadie, Martin, some under aliases, some coded, some not, some as bold as day, others scribbled in a hurried or tired hand, some of which I had no idea about or even a clue as to who they were. One thing, however, should be made clear. I, Hank Albarelli, as the author of this book, do not own any of Lafitte's date books or letters. Fortunately, I've been granted the right to reproduce certain selections from the 63 date book, but there are contents in those date books that the Lafitte family do not want published. Renee Lafitte was adamant about this and would not agree to anything else. It took considerable effort to convince her and others that I be allowed to reproduce her insightful comment after JFK's death, recorded in a November 23 entry. Renee says, "Coup de grace." After a number of years of patient and respectful but persistent interactions with certain members of the Lafitte family, as he indicates, Hank was finally able to take possession of the date book and several other Lafitte documents for the singular purpose of having them authenticated. He did not shy away from that exercise. The examination process, which included ink, paper, and handwriting analysis, was funded by an international documentary film company that had persuaded Hank they had contacts with major distributors, including networks and HBO. He was assured they were pursuing the best deal for development and production of a 6 to 8 part series centered around the Lafitte material and Hank's Kennedy investigation. Unfortunately, weeks before he fell ill, we were in negotiations with the producer in an effort to smooth out both parties' concerns. The producer insisted they couldn't move forward until they had access to more exemplars of Lafitte's handwriting and until they read Hank's manuscript. Of course, when they got more examples, they got more information. Hank's concerns included any false assumption that the documentary company had any semblance of ownership or control over this date book. Unfortunately, in the process, the preliminary reports from document authenticators in London, funded by the production company, fell through the cracks, and those reports remain under a non-disclosure agreement. The company continues to refuse to release them, so after almost 3 years of haggling, we finally gained possession of the date book and have initiated our own forensics examination. As anticipated, the results thus far are inconclusive. A team headed by a board-certified document examiner with over 30 years' experience, whose credentials include a master's degree in forensic science from George Washington University in D.C., and a long-term board member of several professional organizations, is at work as we speak, conducting the next phase of what has turned out to be a more complex exercise than appeared initially. There remain a number of mysteries. We have provided them with samples of what we know to be Lafitte's handwriting to compare with that's seen in the date book. Similar to the initial effort in London, they insist on more exemplars or samples before providing a final report. Complicating matters is Renee's assertion that Pierre had suffered a mild stroke in 1962, which affected his penmanship considerably. We are, however, assured that Subject 1, aka Pierre Lafitte, was an author of the majority of the entries. In addition, we've provided them with several other handwriting exemplars to determine if there were possibly 2, maybe even 3 authors, as initially suspected with the naked eye. After almost 70 hours of professional analysis thus far, we are told that that may not be the case. It may be only Lafitte. We are also advised that ink and pen analysis, while critical to determining precisely when the entries were made, the database repository for ink and pencil that are by requirement registered with the government now was not launched until early 1970s. Therefore, at this stage, a formal report, if we pressed for it, a definitive, would be inconclusive. So we intend to continue this very costly process and keep Hank's readers involved and informed. For those interested and assuming we can have access to this room following Gary Shaw's intriguing presentation, I must say, we will provide screenshots of a select number of datebook entries and answer related questions if anyone wants to come back.
5 minutes. Good timing. All right, I'll give a quick opportunity to Casey to say anything that he might want to say about this book. He's perused it tremendously.
Yes, I have, but I want to let you guys know something that, and I think most of you understand what's going on here. You're looking at actual history taking place right here. You're looking at the primary researchers of this particular book, even though that Hank is no longer with us. But I think this is one of the most unique finds in our history, and it's only taken us 59 years to get to that point. Where in the hell was the United States government in allowing us to see this material? I don't think they have this material. I think it was written down by individuals like Pierre Lafitte, as Gary will talk about his book here in just a few minutes. But I want you to realize that after 59 years, we have some remarkable individuals, and you're seeing two of them up here, and Leslie Sharp and Alan Kent. And not that the other researchers aren't, but this is one of the most remarkable books that has come out recently. And like my wife the other day said, you know, she says, are you finished with your slide presentation? And I said, yes, I just cut out 250 slides. And that is no lie. In going through this book and trying to put this thing together, it is a massive situation where I enjoy doing this. But I could teach an entire class for at least a month on this whole thing, as most of you already know. But the information that these two individuals have brought out, phenomenal. And I would like for you to give them a round of applause for the work that they have done.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for listening. You listened good. Thank you, Alan and Leslie and Casey, and they'll be around to answer questions. This is an important book. Pay attention.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I found that incredibly interesting. I hope you did too. If you would give another round of applause, please, for Gary Shaw, Leslie Sharp, Alan Kent, and Casey Quinlan.